The conference room erupted in laughter the second I finished my presentation, not polite chuckles. Full-throated, gasping for air laughter that made my cheeks burn like someone had slapped me across the face with a branding iron. Delaney Korkowski, the HR director, actually wiped tears from her eyes as she looked around the table at the other executives, all of them shaking their heads like I'd just suggested we fund a mission to Mars using paperclips and rubber bands. 6.2 million, she repeated, drawing out each syllable like she was explaining basic math to a kindergartner, for employee wellness and retention programs. In one fiscal year. More snickering from around the mahogany. No, wait, the dark wooden table that probably cost more than my annual salary. Hi, I'm Sasha Vasquez, and before I continue with what happened next, please tell me in the comments where you're listening from because I want to know where my story is reaching people who understand what it feels like to be completely dismissed. And please like, subscribe, and hit the bell because what happened after this moment changed everything, and I mean everything, about how I view corporate power and the people who think they're untouchable. So there I was, 3 years into my role as senior program coordinator at one of the biggest consulting firms in the city. I'd spent 6 months researching, building spreadsheets, conducting surveys, analyzing turnover costs, and putting together what I genuinely believed was a bulletproof business case. Our company was hemorrhaging talent. People were leaving faster than we could replace them, and exit interviews kept mentioning the same things: burnout, lack of support, feeling like just another number in a machine that ground them up and spit them out. My proposal wasn't some fluffy feel-good nonsense. I'd calculated exactly how much we were losing in recruitment costs, training expenses, lost productivity, and client relationship damage when experienced people walked out the door. The numbers were staggering. We were bleeding money, and I had a plan to stop it. Mental health support, flexible work arrangements, professional development stipends, team building that actually built teams instead of just wasting everyone's time, and a comprehensive wellness program that would make people want to stay. But apparently, none of that mattered to Delaney and her crew of executives who saw employees as interchangeable parts rather than human beings with lives, dreams, and breaking points. "Sasha," she said, leaning back in her chair with this expression like she was explaining reality to someone who'd been living under a rock for decades. "I appreciate your enthusiasm. Really, I do. But you need to understand something about how business works in the real world. We're not a charity. We're not here to coddle people who can't handle the pressures of a competitive environment." Trevor Blackwood, the CFO, nodded along like a bobblehead. "The budget simply isn't there for projects like this. We have shareholders to consider, profit margins to maintain. 6.2 million? That's completely unrealistic for what amounts to making people feel better about their jobs. If they want wellness programs, they can join a gym on their own dime." I felt my throat tighten, but I pushed forward. The return on investment is clear in the data. We're losing 43% more employees than industry average. Each departure costs us approximately dead. "Costs us what?" Delaney interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "The cost of finding someone hungrier, someone who actually wants to work instead of complaining about stress and work-life balance? Sasha, you're thinking like an employee, not like leadership. Sometimes turnover is healthy. It weeds out the weak links." The room fell silent except for the humming of the air conditioning and the sound of my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked around at faces that had already moved on, executives checking their phones and shuffling papers like my months of work were nothing more than an interruption in their important day. "I understand your concerns," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But what happens when we can't fill positions fast enough? When client projects suffer because we don't have experienced people?" "That's operational stuff." Trevor waved his hand dismissively. "Not strategic thinking. You're focused on problems instead of solutions. Real solutions. Cost-effective ones that don't involve throwing money at people who should be grateful to have jobs in the first place." Delaney stood up, smoothing down her designer blazer. "I'm going to give you some advice, Sasha, and I hope you'll take it in the spirit it's intended. Learn to work with what you have. Stretch dollars instead of asking for more. Find creative ways to solve problems without opening the company checkbook. That's what separates coordinators from directors. That's what separates people who advance in their careers from people who stay exactly where they are. The meeting ended with my proposal going straight into the trash, metaphorically speaking. Actually, Delaney probably had her assistant shred it for good measure. I gathered my materials, thanked everyone for their time like a good little employee, and walked back to my cubicle feeling like I'd been hit by a freight train. But here's what none of them knew about me. What none of them bothered to learn during my 3 years of quietly doing excellent work, exceeding every target, and solving problems they didn't even know existed. I didn't just have a bachelor's degree in organizational psychology. I had a master's degree in data analytics that I'd earned at night while working full-time, studying in bathroom stalls during breaks and staying up until 3 in the morning because I wanted to understand how organizations really worked beneath all the corporate speak and pretty mission statements. And I was really, really good at finding patterns in data that other people missed. That afternoon, I sat at my desk staring at my computer screen, but I wasn't working on the quarterly reports that were supposed to be my priority. I was thinking about something Delaney had said. Something about shareholders and profit margins, and how 6.2 million was unrealistic for employee programs. See, I had access to a lot of company information in my role: budget reports, departmental spending, vendor contracts, project allocations. It was all part of my job to track program costs and effectiveness across different divisions. Most people in my position just looked at their own little slice of the pie, but I'd always been curious about the bigger picture: how money flowed through the organization, where the real priorities lived versus where they claimed to live. So I started digging. Not into anything I wasn't authorized to see, not hacking or stealing or doing anything that would get me fired or arrested. Just looking more carefully at the public information I already had access to, cross-referencing spending patterns, and asking questions about numbers that didn't quite add up. And that's when I found that's when I found the Executive Discretionary Fund. $7.8 million, allocated annually, for strategic initiatives and leadership development opportunities, managed entirely by the executive team with minimal oversight and no requirement for detailed reporting to the board. $7.8 million that, according to the documentation I could access, was being spent on things like executive retreats at 5-star resorts, first-class travel to conferences in exotic locations, luxury team-building experiences, private dining events, and something vaguely labeled as leadership wellness programs that looked suspiciously like spa treatments and golf outings. The same executives who'd laughed at my $6.2 million proposal for actual employee support were spending nearly $8 million on themselves every single year. They had their own wellness programs, their own stress relief, their own work-life balance initiatives. They just didn't want to share any of it with the people who actually did the work that made their bonuses possible. But that wasn't even the most interesting part of what I discovered. The really interesting part was buried in the fine print of vendor contracts and expense reports. These executive retreats and leadership development experiences, they weren't just expensive. They were consistently over budget, sometimes by huge amounts. A weekend retreat budgeted for $50,000 would somehow cost $90,000. A conference that should have been $20,000 in travel and accommodation would balloon to $45,000. And when I cross-referenced the dates of these expensive leadership experiences with our company's productivity reports, client satisfaction scores, and employee retention numbers, I found something that made my blood pressure spike. Every single time the executives went on one of their costly retreats or development experiences, our operational performance dropped, client complaints increased, project deadlines were missed. Employee satisfaction surveys showed people feeling more stressed and unsupported than ever. The leadership was literally spending millions of dollars on activities that made them worse at their jobs while telling regular employees that investing in their wellness was unrealistic and financially irresponsible. I spent the next 2 weeks quietly gathering every piece of documentation I could access, not stealing anything, not breaking any rules, just being very, very thorough about understanding how our company's money was actually being spent versus how they claimed it was being spent. And then I had an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. What if I could find a way to make them need exactly what they'd rejected? What if I could create a situation where they would be forced to implement employee wellness and retention programs, not because it was the right thing to do, but because their own survival depended on it? I knew something they didn't know I knew. I'd been tracking industry trends, competitor analysis, client satisfaction patterns, and employee retention data across our entire sector. And there was a storm coming that they were completely unprepared for. 3 of our biggest competitors were actively poaching our talent with aggressive recruitment campaigns that specifically targeted the areas where we were weakest: employee support, career development, work-life balance, all the things Delaney had dismissed as coddling. But more than that, I'd noticed something in our client feedback patterns, something subtle that the executives wouldn't see because they didn't dig into the detailed data the way I did. Our clients were starting to express concerns about continuity, about working with inexperienced team members, about projects that felt rushed or understaffed. We were approaching a tipping point where our refusal to invest in employee retention was going to start costing us major client relationships. And when that happened, all their fancy retreats and leadership development experiences wouldn't matter because there wouldn't be enough revenue to fund them. The question was, how could I accelerate that timeline and make sure the consequences landed exactly where they needed to land? That's when I remembered something from my data analytics training, something about system vulnerabilities and cascade failures. How small changes in complex systems could trigger much larger consequences if you understood the pressure points and timing. I started mapping our company's ecosystem: client relationships, project timelines, employee departure schedules, competitor recruitment cycles, industry conference seasons, budget approval processes, all of it. Looking for the moment when everything would be most fragile, most susceptible to disruption. And I found it. There was a 6-week window coming up where everything would align perfectly. 3 major client renewals, 2 critical project launches, 5 key employees who I knew from analyzing patterns were likely to receive competing job offers, budget planning season for the next fiscal year, and most importantly, the annual board meeting where executives had to present their performance metrics and justify their strategic decisions. If I could orchestrate things correctly, I could create a situation where the executives would be forced to request exactly what they'd rejected from me: $6.2 million for employee wellness and retention programs. But this time, they wouldn't be laughing. They'd be desperate. The plan I came up with was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. I wasn't going to sabotage anything or hurt anyone or break any rules. I was just going to help reality catch up with their arrogance a little faster than it would have naturally. First, I started having very careful, very strategic conversations with the employees I knew were most likely to leave, not convincing them to quit, not bad-mouthing the company, just listening to their concerns, validating their frustrations, and occasionally mentioning that I'd heard interesting things about opportunities at competitor firms. Information that was completely true and readily available if they chose to look into it. Second, I began documenting everything with obsessive precision. Every missed deadline that could be traced to understaffing. Every client complaint that mentioned continuity issues. Every project delay caused by having to bring new people up to speed. I created detailed reports that I shared with my immediate supervisor under the guise of quarterly performance analysis, making sure there was a paper trail showing that these problems were escalating. Third, I started attending industry networking events and conferences where I knew our competitors would be recruiting. Not to job hunt for myself, but to understand exactly what they were offering and how they were positioning themselves against us. Information that would be very useful when the time came to explain to our executives why we were losing talent. And finally, I did something that felt risky but was completely within my authority as someone responsible for tracking program effectiveness across the organization. I scheduled a series of anonymous employee satisfaction surveys, timed to coincide with the period when workplace stress would be at its highest due to project pressures and leadership absences. The results were going to be devastating, and they were going to land on executive desks at exactly the moment when those executives would be scrambling to explain to the board why our performance metrics were in freefall. But the most beautiful part of my plan was something that wouldn't become apparent until much later. something that would make everything else seem small by comparison. I was going to make them fund my rejected proposal using their own discretionary money, every single dollar of it. See, while I was researching the executive fund spending, I'd discovered something that made my analytics-trained brain light up like a Christmas tree. Their expensive leadership retreats and wellness programs weren't just hypocritical. They were creating a massive compliance liability that nobody had noticed because the documentation was scattered across different budget categories and vendor contracts. Our company had very strict policies about employee benefits and wellness spending. Everything had to be equitable, transparent, and available to all employees at the same level, or it violated our own internal equity guidelines and potentially opened us up to discrimination claims. The executives thought they were being clever by categorizing their spa treatments and luxury retreats as leadership development, but what they'd actually done was create a paper trail showing that wellness benefits were being provided to some employees but not others, based solely on their position in the hierarchy. That was the nuclear option sitting in my back pocket, but I wasn't going to use it unless I absolutely had to, because I wanted something even more satisfying than just exposing their hypocrisy. I wanted them to voluntarily, desperately request exactly what they'd rejected. I wanted them to beg for it. The 6-week countdown began on a Monday morning when the first domino fell exactly as I'd predicted. Jessica Moreau, one of our top project managers, submitted her resignation. Her exit interview, which I knew would be forwarded to department heads, cited everything I'd mentioned in my original proposal: burnout, lack of support, feeling undervalued despite consistently exceeding performance targets. 3 days later, David Park followed. Then Miranda Collins, all within the same week, all for the same reasons. All taking their expertise in client relationships to competitors who'd offered them better work environments along with better salaries. I watched Delaney's stress levels climbing during our weekly staff meetings. She kept making comments about ungrateful employees and people who couldn't handle a challenging environment, but I could see the panic building behind her professional facade. Replacing one experienced employee was manageable. Replacing 3 simultaneously during peak project season, while maintaining client satisfaction standards, that was a crisis. By week 2, the client complaints started rolling in. Not anything dramatic enough to terminate contracts, but pointed questions about project continuity, concerns about having to re-explain requirements to new team members, subtle hints that they were evaluating whether our firm was still the right fit for their needs. I made sure these complaints were documented thoroughly in my weekly operational reports, cross-referenced with departmental staffing levels and project timeline impacts. Professional, factual, completely objective analysis that painted an increasingly dire picture of our organizational stability. Week 3 brought the competitor pressure I'd been tracking. 2 of our biggest rival firms launched aggressive recruitment campaigns, specifically targeting our remaining senior staff. They weren't just offering more money, they were advertising comprehensive wellness programs, mental health support, flexible work arrangements, professional development opportunities. Everything our executives had deemed financially irresponsible. The beautiful irony was that our competitors weren't necessarily offering these benefits because they were more compassionate. They were offering them because they'd done the same cost-benefit analysis I'd done and reached the same conclusion I'd reached. Investing in employee retention was cheaper than constantly recruiting and training replacements. But our leadership was too prideful to admit they'd made a strategic error. Instead, they doubled down on their position that people leaving was natural turnover and that the right employees would stay regardless of benefits. Week 4 was when everything started accelerating beyond what even I had anticipated. The anonymous employee satisfaction survey results came back, and they were absolutely brutal. Morale scores in the basement. Stress levels through the roof. 91% of respondents saying they were actively considering other employment options. Comments that read like a catalog of every organizational psychology principle being violated simultaneously. But the survey results weren't just numbers on a page. They were landing in executive inboxes at the exact moment when those executives were trying to prepare for quarterly performance reviews with increasingly unhappy clients and a staffing crisis that was getting worse by the day. I started hearing things in meetings. Panicked conversations about recruitment timelines and training costs, and whether we'd be able to fulfill our contractual obligations if more people left. Delaney snapping at people in ways that would have been completely unprofessional if anyone below executive level had witnessed them. Trevor was pushing for hiring temporary contractors to fill gaps, but even he was starting to realize that bringing in outside people for client-facing roles would create more problems than it solved. Clients didn't want to work with temps who didn't understand their business history or project requirements. Week 5 brought the perfect storm I'd been orchestrating. 2 more key employees gave notice. A major client called an emergency meeting to express concerns about project delays and team changes. The board announced they'd be conducting an unscheduled operational review due to inconsistencies in performance metrics across departments. And that's when Delaney made the mistake that sealed everything. She called an all-hands meeting to address what she termed recent challenges in team stability. But instead of acknowledging any responsibility for the situation, she used the meeting to lecture the remaining staff about loyalty and commitment and how successful companies required employees who could adapt to changing conditions without needing constant support and validation. It was exactly the wrong message at exactly the wrong time, delivered in exactly the wrong way. I watched people's faces during that meeting, and I knew we were about to lose even more talent. The survey had shown that people were considering leaving. Delaney's tone-deaf speech was going to push them from considering to deciding. I didn't have to encourage anyone to update their resumes or reach out to recruiters. I just had to sit back and watch the consequences of leadership that was so disconnected from reality that they thought the solution to people feeling unsupported was to tell them they shouldn't need support. Week 6 arrived with the subtlety of a wrecking ball. 3 more resignation letters. A client cancellation. Another client putting their contract renewal on hold pending organizational stability assessment. The board scheduling an emergency meeting to review operational performance and strategic direction. And that's when I got the call that made every moment of planning worth it. Delaney's assistant contacted me on Thursday afternoon asking if I could attend an urgent executive strategy session Friday morning. The agenda, she said, was organizational resilience and employee retention initiatives. I spent Thursday evening reviewing my original proposal, making minor updates to reflect current staffing levels and client feedback, but keeping the core recommendations and budget projections exactly the same. $6.2 million for comprehensive employee wellness and retention programs. Friday morning, I walked into the same conference room where I'd been laughed at 6 weeks earlier. But this time, nobody was laughing. Delaney looked like she hadn't slept in days. Trevor was frantically reviewing budget spreadsheets. The other executives were hunched over their phones, fielding calls from worried board members and frustrated clients. "Sasha," Delaney said without any of her usual condescending pleasantries, "we need to discuss immediate interventions for employee retention and organizational stability. The board is requiring comprehensive solutions by Monday morning." I sat down and calmly pulled out my folder. "I may have some ideas that could help." "We're looking at a serious situation here," Trevor jumped in. "We need programs that will demonstrate our commitment to employee well-being while addressing the retention issues that are impacting client relationships. Cost is less of a constraint than it was previously." I pretended to consider this thoughtfully. "What kind of budget parameters are we working with?" Delaney and Trevor exchanged glances. "What would you estimate for a comprehensive program that addresses all the concerns we've been hearing?" I opened my folder and pulled out the same proposal they'd rejected 6 weeks earlier. Based on my analysis of our retention challenges and industry best practices, I'd estimate approximately $6.2 million for a complete employee wellness and retention initiative. The room went dead silent. Not the mocking silence from before, but the desperate silence of people realizing they were about to request exactly what they'd dismissed as unrealistic fantasy. "That seems reasonable," Delaney said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What would that include?" I went through my original presentation point by point. Mental health support programs, flexible work arrangements, professional development stipends, comprehensive wellness initiatives, team building that actually built teams. Everything they'd laughed at was now being discussed as essential business strategy. The timeline for implementation, Trevor asked. Given the urgency of the situation, I could have preliminary programs launched within 2 weeks and full implementation within 6 weeks. And you're confident this would address the retention issues we're experiencing? I looked around the table at faces that had gone from arrogant dismissal to desperate hope. The data suggests these programs could reduce turnover by 60 to 70% while improving client satisfaction scores and operational performance metrics. That's when Trevor asked the question that made everything perfect. Where would this funding come from, given our current budget constraints? I pretended to think about this, flipping through my folder like I was considering various options. Well, there is the Executive Discretionary Fund. $7.8 million allocated annually for strategic initiatives. This would certainly qualify as strategic, and it would still leave funds available for essential leadership development activities. The executives look like they'd been hit by lightning. They'd just been asked to fund employee wellness programs using the money they'd been spending on their own luxury retreats and spa treatments. But they couldn't say no, not with the board breathing down their necks, not with clients questioning their operational stability, not with their own jobs potentially on the line if they couldn't demonstrate concrete solutions to the crisis they'd created through their own arrogance. That could work, Delaney said finally. Let's move forward with developing a detailed implementation plan. The meeting ended with me being given full authority to design and launch the employee wellness and retention programs I'd originally proposed. Same budget, same scope, same timeline. But now, instead of being dismissed as unrealistic, it was being treated as essential emergency intervention. Walking back to my desk that afternoon, I felt something I'd never experienced before in a corporate environment. Not satisfaction exactly, and definitely not revenge in any petty sense. It was more like justice, like the universe had finally aligned itself correctly. But the real victory wasn't just getting my programs approved. It was knowing that from now on, when executives in our company wanted to spend money on their own comfort while denying support to the people who actually did the work, they'd have to explain why leadership wellness was more important than employee wellness. They'd have to justify why their stress relief mattered more than everyone else's. I'd changed the conversation permanently, and I'd done it without breaking any rules, hurting anyone, or compromising my own integrity. 6 months later, our retention rates had improved by 68%. Client satisfaction scores were at all-time highs. Employee engagement surveys showed people actually enjoyed coming to work. We'd won 2 major new contracts specifically because potential clients were impressed by our organizational culture and staff stability. And Delaney? She was still in her role, but now she had to manage wellness programs that provided actual support to actual employees instead of just luxury experiences for executives. Every quarterly review, she had to present data showing how investing in people's well-being had improved every metric that mattered to the company's success. The best part is that she had to take credit for the program's success. She couldn't admit that she'd initially rejected them, so she had to pretend that comprehensive employee support had always been part of her strategic vision. Sometimes I catch her looking at me during meetings with this expression like she knows exactly what happened but can't prove it. And honestly, I'm fine with that. I don't need recognition for orchestrating the whole thing. I just need to know that people in our company now have access to the support they deserve. That's my story. If you've ever been dismissed, laughed at, or told your ideas were unrealistic by people who've never done the actual work, I want you to know that patience and strategic thinking can be more powerful than any title or authority. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's just helping reality catch up with arrogance. Please like this video if it resonated with you. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about workplace justice. And let me know in the comments if you've ever had to find creative ways to make stubborn leadership listen to common sense. Your support means everything to someone who learned that being underestimated can actually be the greatest advantage of all.